All right, we are live. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 International E-Conference on Interreligious Dialogue. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, one of the great things about GCRR is that you can attend these academic conferences from the comfort and safety of your own home without having to worry about hotel fees and travel costs. In fact, you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world right now. And because each of these presentations are video recorded, the information presented here will be available all across the globe for millions of people to see. Now, for those attending live, as you listen to each of the presentations, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and our speaker will do their best to answer them at the end of the presentation. And with that said, I'd like to introduce to you my good friend and the next presenter, Chung-Wai Lak. Allow me to share my screen to give a proper introduction. Now, Chung-Wai Lak is going to be discussing freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. He is a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. And his research focuses on things like formal theories, such as decision theory, game theory, probability theory, modal logic, computability theory, learning theory, and connectionism to describe the metaphysics of action. And he hopes to further formal theory of self-determination in investigation of spirituality. And with that said, I want to say thank you so much for being here tonight and presenting. You have the floor.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right. So thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Here's what I'm going to talk about today is freedom of conscience and freedom of expression, because as everyone knows, it's guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed by the members of the United Nations. Let me read these two articles. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So that's Article 18. And there's Article 19, which says that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So that's Article 19. And this interacts with religion because, well, so everyone is free to think and to talk. So where does it stand with religion, especially when there are competing views, right? Because when we face the world, maybe there's an objectivity to what the world is. So what about religion? It seems that this will be what makes all interesting and especially difficult. And today's outline, I'll go into, because we're talking about freedom of conscience and of expression. So I'll just highlight what thought and speech are in a very general way. And then I'll go into talk about what freedom and liberty are and their differences. There are subtle differences between these two things. And with liberty, I want to talk about right and duty, especially when we are talking about our right and duty over others, our dependent, especially our children. Because as I'll show in another article from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's something else that this deserves our attention. And then I'll talk about the differences between religion and culture, to highlight the difference between a cultural pluralism and something else that has to do with religion. And I also want to talk about faith, which I hope is objective, and this touches on a very controversial issue over exclusivism. But I won't go directly into that, but it'll be tangential. tangentially related to other speakers, and then I'll talk about what rationality and reasonableness are. These are more philosophical notions in my tradition in analytic philosophy. And what I want to make the point is that we can have the conviction that believers have without, and also have the humility. These two things seems incompatible, but after all this, what I want to say is that we can, I won't keep this hidden. I speak also with, from my perspective, I'm a Christian, and I won't hide my conviction, but I will demonstrate how these are compatible with an open dialogue. All right, so thought and speech. So these are very simple things. So what thoughts are? Well, we all know that when you are listening to me, you're thinking, well, what is he talking about? Where is he from? Maybe you're thinking about possibilities, about ways I might be. And then when you endorse some of those thoughts, oh yeah, he's a Chinese, he's speaking English, he's talking about freedom of conscience. So among those thoughts, you endorse some of them and you believe those thoughts. So thought and belief, there's some slight differences. Maybe you can think about something without believing it. So freedom of thoughts, and what's important is that freedom of conscience, that we're talking about what we are to believe, right? We should have the freedom to believe. And from philosophy, there's an idea of what the norm of belief, how we should decide to believe. And some propose that we should believe on knowledge. We should believe only on what we know. And this depends on evidence and reason. So we collect evidence and we reason and think about what the evidence leads us to. So that's thought and speech. So we believe certain thing, and when we interact with each other, we want to express our thoughts, where we want others to know what we are thinking, and especially for those that we believe in, we want others to know what we believe in as well, so they will come to hopefully know what we know as well. So let's say I saw something in Hong Kong and I want to tell other people somewhere else, and assert the content of my belief, and in the hope that they would know what I know. So we want to express our thoughts, and in the midst of exchange, we will exchange our ideas. So the good thing about assertion, hopefully, would be that we assert only on knowledge. So we don't just say anything we want, because the whole point about freedom of speech and expression and freedom of conscience and freedom of thoughts, there are we that free, right? So I hope to investigate what kind of freedom we should have. So typically, if we talk in order so that we will come to know more about the world, we should trust only those that are trustworthy, and through persuasion, we get others to understand or even know what we want to impart on them, the information we want to impart on them. So assertion, knowledge, so that's some idea about speech, especially when we communicate. When we are talking about knowledge, the individual knowledge acquisition, we see the world, we perceive the world, and there's cognition. When we see the world as a certain way, we also think about how the world is and reason and make hypotheses. And even as scientists, we might do experiment, or maybe we go on about the world, and let's say, oh, so you see me talking, maybe you would think a certain way about what I'm gonna say, and this will keep updating how you think about the world. Individually, that's how we do it, and through communication, we also have collective knowledge transfer. Through testimony, you will know what I see. Today's a good day, nice weather in Hong Kong. Maybe you're from somewhere else around the world, you might not know that. So you will know that through testimony. And that's what communication does. And given this background about freedom, thought, speech, so what about liberty, right? The good thing about freedom of speech is that if we are restricted with our epistemic interactions when we talk, there are things that we can't talk about. Maybe we won't get to the end point that we always wanted, right? Because an unrestricted epistemic interaction when we discuss, it's free. And the hope of being free is that we will have better collective knowledge. If I know what I know, I saw what I saw, and without restriction, I can tell you what I saw, you will have more information than you would have had if our interactions were restricted, right? So our evidence, you can assess it as well. And also how I think about those evidence, I make arguments about what conclusions to draw. Maybe given, now you know my evidence, maybe you would also come in and make your argument. So through dialectics, through our interaction, we hope that we will process their information better. And these couldn't have been performed without the freedom of speech, right? So this is just the typical liberal argument for why we should have free speech. But then, given that our goal of communication is to transmit knowledge, we have to think about what evidence are. Maybe evidence have to be factive. That means it has to be factual. You can't present fake evidence, right? You can make up evidence and pretend to be something else. So that, as with freedom of speech, we have to restrict it with fact, and with argument, we have to restrict it with logical argument. So although we are talking about freedom of speech, it is limited, and limited by the wrong use. We ought not have used our freedom in the wrong way. It sounds circular, but there's on the one hand, we want freedom, but it is not with everything. We can't just do whatever we want. And that's where liberty comes in, right? And let's think about this a little bit. Freedom to do the right thing is liberty. Why is that? Because when you think about what's right and what's free, there are some free acts that are not right. Given that you join this lecture in the hope to learn something, it's free for you to space out, to close your eyes. These are things that are free for you to do, but probably that's not right, because otherwise you would not have joined. It would be a waste of time. You could have done something else, right? So some free acts are not right. So you have the freedom to do a certain thing. You may even have the freedom to say a certain thing, but some of them are not right. And some right acts are not free. Let's say it's right that we met in person, but given the pandemic, we're not free to do that. So some right acts are not free. So with this logical relation in mind, you will see that freedom and liberty, if liberty is simply the freedom to do the right thing, then you will see that there are people without the liberty because there are right things that they can't do. And that's where, in the context of talking about freedom and human rights and dignity, and we need to clarify these notions. So liberty as freedom restricted with morality. So yes, freedom, yeah, we want that. But liberty is something more difficult. It's the freedom to do with the right thing. It's not only just freedom. So to take an example, it's if someone is your friend, it's wrong to disinform him or her, right? So in typical situation, you should not lie to the person. But sometimes, given the freedom of our interaction, I can tell her things I might have mistakenly misinformed the person. So the freedom that I have, I might have used it wrongly. I might have mistakenly misinformed her. But that's the price of freedom. So we have the freedom, but it's for liberty, for doing the right thing. So we might be mistaken, but we want freedom to do the right thing. So these interacts with freedom of speech because, well, we're free to say those things, but are we saying the right thing, right? And that's what I bring in is right and duty, because when we're talking about right and wrong things, there are things that maybe we're not sure that we are right, but we will still do it. Let's say in Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, Clause 3, it says parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So we have parents have right over the children about the education. They can choose what kind of education they are to receive. And so, of course, there's some presumption here that, of course, the parent has to be in good faith. Typically, why would you want to harm your child, right? So in good faith and competence, maybe you're not too confused. You have the necessary competence to make judgments for your kids. So you do have a right over your minor. And that's where it goes, because the freedom of speech discussion is usually along the liberalism discussion, and paternalism is typically in contrast to liberalism. But in this case, maybe your child, an infant, let's say he doesn't speak yet, he doesn't respond to verbal command that well. So it is about to fall in a well. Just what you do is you limit its to do whatever it wants, such as crawling ahead, and because it'll fall to the well. So you pick your infant up, and that's limiting its freedom. And on the other hand, if you contrast that with your friend, let's say, well, given Christianity, you will think, oh, he doesn't believe it, he'll go to hell. But you can't do the similar thing with him. It's not like you can pick him up against its will, because when you pick up your child, maybe he'll cry, he wants to go on playing, but you can't do that. You're an adult, especially not, you don't have the right over your friend as you do with your child, right? And if you can see the difference, and the problem is, what about nudging your child's Christianity with Sunday school? So many Christian parents, they will send their kids to the church's Sunday school. Well, it's not against their will. It's fine. They listen to their parents. They go there, but they didn't go there like, oh, after having considered all faiths, and then I want to choose. They've been nudged. Their life trajectory is towards Christianity because of the parents' decision. And do we have the right over the children about that? That's something that I want to explore. And this brings up the following, because given, again, I'm presupposing Christianity here, the right that your child believed in Christ. Let's say we agree that. So it is your duty that she did, right? So this is very simple. But then there are very typical situations in not always right to commit what you believe in to other people. So when you commit, let's say your subordinates, those that listen to you, those that have to listen to your command, only to what you know. So there's a difference between mere knowledge and knowledge of knowledge. But that's a very complex epistemological idea. So I just say that if you have a hypothesis about what's right, there's a guy called Barry Marshall. He has a hypothesis, but almost no one believed him, and he tested that on himself. That's something that he couldn't have tested on someone else, because that's actually, they caused ulcer, and that's bad. He tested the hypothesis on himself, and he took a chance on himself, and he proved his point. He can't do what he knows, well, to be a fact. He can't test the hypothesis on someone else, on himself. So it seems that there's a difference between knowledge and responsibility. I can do that on myself, but I can't do that on someone else. Similarly, maybe I have to believe in Christ or in other religions, but what have to commit children to what I believe in? So this gets complicated, but I want to distinguish religion from culture, right? So maybe cultural, there's a cultural pluralism, like given the morality, underdetermines driving side, like drive on the right or the left. In convention, the law through mutual agreement that some members of those nations, they decide to drive one way instead of another. So morality doesn't decide that. They come up and agree to drive one way instead of another. So that's a simple point. But then there's the cultural norms. Some people are born into a culture, born into a Chinese society, and I started eating with chopsticks, right? But it doesn't commit me to only using chopsticks. Maybe someone in the Western culture born, they grew up using forks and knives, but it's being born into a culture does not restrict us only to do a certain thing a certain way. And so morality underdetermines how the cultural norms are, and humanity, human beings, humanity does not restrict us what we may do or may not do, in a way that culture is open and humanity might choose. It's not in virtue of being born into a culture that we must do a certain thing a certain way. So this is a very simple point about the different culture and the different right way to do things within the culture, but it doesn't mean that one culture's right way is another culture's. Well, these are compatible. So chopsticks, forks and knives, but we can both use our own way of eating, and that's fine on both sides. But religion, I want to say that it's a little bit different. Religion is, let's say, it's a culture, but it's restricted with sacredness. So because mere culture, when we talk about eating, it doesn't include the sacred, right? Usually the sacred would be rituals with supernatural significance. Like in Chinese, there's in typical households, we have a place where we burn incense and in memory of our ancestors. And these are rituals. Some would just do that as a reference to the elder who passed away. Some do that in the hope that they will look over us and help us and keep us safe. So these are rituals with supernatural significance. Let's say these are culture, but a little bit more with something that's sacred. That makes it religion. And this is something very controversial, I know, because I don't think that religions are all equal. There are, especially, there are inconsistent doctrines, right? Because let's say the Jewish people think that, well, about the Judaism, they're still waiting for the Messiah, but Christianity, we think that Jesus is Christ. So these two things are inconsistent. They can't be both true. So these two religions are incompatible. And given the incompatibility, they can't be both real at the same time. Maybe both are not real, maybe one of them is, but it can't be both. So I want to push how we have this view without losing sight of the humility that we ought to have, especially the atrocity that religions might have led us towards. So I want to see how we can do that. So, and notably, each respective believers in a respective religion, they have indistinguishably with evidence of the sacred. So for them, they have experienced the sacred. They're not lying. Of course, they're very sincere. They believed it 100%, and someone else believed it 100%. But what I'm trying to say is that metaphysically, it's incompatible, and we live in the same world, and how we're going to live with that difference. Okay. Of course, to go a little bit further from culture, religion, and theology for Christians, it's Christian theology. The sacred, it's the holiness, and that's when we do theology is to do Christianity without neutrality. Maybe religious studies, we will have the neutrality and say that the sacred in this religion, there's the sacred in that religion. But for Christianity, they will insist that's the only sacred, which is holy. And let's say when we take a communion, we would something that it's a sacred ceremony, and some would think that there's something holy about what we're doing, and that holiness has something that has to do with the divine, and these for Christian are real instead of just a pretense, right? So theology goes a little bit further. So we make more presuppositions about what we're doing when we engage in a certain practice. And of course, there's the St. Anselm's way of doing theology, which is faith, seeking understanding. So these are very different ways of doing things, although the focus is still on humanity and what we do. And yeah, so that's where I want to go into my discussion of faith and its objectivity. So faith, again, because I can only speak from my perspective, so I'll talk about the Christian way of faith. It's for Paul, the apostle, he says that there's justification through faith in Romans. And I want to thematize it a little bit because the power to believe constitutes evidence, because it's in virtue of power to believe, especially in difficult situations, that makes it different, right? Because there's Christ, not everyone can believe in anything. Not anyone could believe in just anything, right? So there's something special that we can believe it that seems to be beyond evidence, and we can. So that's the power to believe constitutes evidence. This is something I put in to understand Paul's epistemology of faith. So faith is thus justified. It is justified by our power of belief in virtue of being able to believe beyond evidence, especially just like humanity. So we have faith in humanity, right? And given what other people are doing, we still have faith. And that's something that seems to be beyond evidence, and we can believe that, we can act on that. And that's what I think faith is. And in virtue of having that faith, we are righteous, we're justified because of the knowledge of Christ that believers achieved in taking that leap of faith. So, and this is the first is faith, and the second is to understand the faith, because the Holy Spirit, there's a theory in the Bible, and even later theologians, they talk about a Christian theory of spirituality. That theory explains the power of belief. So there's so let's say you see a watch and it tells you the time, you know what time it is. Well, but if you were to call into question, so how do you know? How do you know the time? It says that it's now 10:30. Then what? How do you know that it's 10:30, right? But once you knew the theory of watches, the theory of, or maybe the theory of how it comes to be trustworthy, then I would say that you come to know that you know. In the first instance, you come to know just by in virtue of looking at the watch. But once you knew more about how do you know your reasons for knowledge, then you achieve something more, which is the knowledge of knowledge. And typical, a believer doesn't have to have that. You have to engage in the theology or apologetics to think about arguments for your faith, right? But the whole part about faith is that you just believe it. And so you can have knowledge and knowledge of knowledge. And given knowledge is factive, it is about the world, and reality is objectively one and only one way. So this is just what I talk about. So I want to stress is that we can have tolerance through humility, without relativism, because I might know that I have a theory about my faith. I understood my faith in a way that maybe I know that I know, but with some work in epistemology, that we can tell the difference between knowing that one knows without a higher order knowledge that I know that I know that I know, because there is someone who seems to know that he knows, and there's me who seems to know that I know, but among us, we can't tell the difference, who's in the right. So that's the kind of conviction that we have, but being open that maybe my knowledge of knowledge is still problematic, because I haven't proved that I know that I know. I only prove that I know, and that's that. So that's how I apply. I'm a, oh, by the way, I'm a philosophy student, as Darren just introduced me. And then I try to apply what I learned and researched in philosophy to theology and my faith, and see what it comes out in interaction with other faiths. So roughly, what the framework of spirituality that I developed, it is developed from a certain perspective, because in order to have experience with the spiritual, you have to have a perspective, right? But I do want to, after having a framework, subtract Christ, Jesus' divinity, and see what's left, and whether that framework is applicable to other faiths, right? Because, well, in Christianity, we talk about the fruits of the Holy Spirit and how we achieved our personal growth through Christ. And of course, the Buddhists who meditate and achieve some kind of serenity. And that's, let's say that's, and I wonder whether my theory of spirituality can explain what their spiritual data, what they achieved through their spirituality, and how their sacredness, what's sacred for them. Well, I want to see whether my theory will be applicable to them as well, and then we can compare through the psychology and faith how our different religions fare, right? So that's, I hope it's a very scientific way of investigating religions. So yes, so after I've talked about faith and objectivity, there's something that's maybe in Chinese, let's say there's, we can talk about what, there are different words for rationality and reasonableness in English as well, but I want to highlight these are two different things. Very roughly, rationality is external and reasonableness is internal, very roughly, because you can be rational without knowing that you're rational. Maybe you go to work today by bus, and without accident, you got to the place you want to go, but you need not have a proof that you will be safe in order to be rational to go by bus, right? So you can be rational without any proof. You can just be rational. You don't have to show that you're rational to do that before you did that. It's so in that way, you can be rational without having to prove it. It's external to you. You don't have to know that you're rational in order for you to do something rational. And you, especially when you bet on something, right? You don't always know that it's the best option, but after, as it turned out, that is the best option, then you know that is the rational decision, right? So rationality is the external, but reasonableness is internal in a way that, well, maybe we want to consider what's reasonable to believe. Some people, some theologians think that theism is coherent, and so it's more likely than not that it's true, and they believe that, and it's reasonable that they believe that because on probability, the evidence seems to point one way instead of another. But then maybe it might have turned out to be irrational. Who knows? Maybe the evidence is deceiving, but on internally decidable procedures, they think that it's better to believe one way instead of another, and that's reasonable. So it's even in the court of law, there's reasonable doubt, and they talk about what's reasonable and reasonable not to do. And so that's internal and external, because I want to bring up, because given rationality, I would be very blatant about that, because whatever religions, or maybe even, well, there's a sacred, and the religions think the sacred is real, the different religions think their sacredness is real. Let's say an atheist would think that there's nothing sacred. Nothing is sacred at all. Let's say an atheist think that, then so different people disagree, and as it turns out, only one religion would have the reality of the sacredness, right? Or maybe no sacredness at all, the atheism thing. So their disagreement, but the disagreement is reasonable because religion's experience is personal and private. My religion, my religious experience might not be shared by you. So you need to have my experience in order to have access to my evidence. So without knowing, without sharing my evidence, you are not in a position to know what I know. So it's reasonable that you disagree with me because you've never been helped by the Holy Spirit. You've never, or maybe to talk with a Buddhist, maybe I've never tried Zen Buddhism, so I never knew what it's like and what they would have experienced. So they have their personal experiences, they have their own evidence, and I don't. So there are differences in evidence. And of course, sometimes we might also have misinterpreted, misunderstood our evidence and only have a coherent explanation. Let's say the creationist story from most theologians, they think they have a coherent explanation of how the world come about. Maybe it's coherent. There's no internal inconsistency, but it might still be false, right? So reasonableness differs from rationality. Maybe in the end, there's only one religion that's rational, but ignoring that, before we can't always know whether we are rational before we are rational, but at least we know that we are reasonable. So that's how there could be reasonable disagreement. And lastly, let me see with the time. Okay, so 4 minutes. I want to talk about how we can have conviction, also be humble. So everyone is born into the world and into a culture, and the presupposition culture and the people who believe in things. We do have to start somewhere. We can't do what there's a philosopher called René Descartes. He wants to call everything into question and start with the first principle and come back from everything else. And that's one way to do philosophy, or even to lead your life, to call everything into question and come back and see what we can do. But typically we have to start somewhere. And what we have now, there are different cultures, there are different religions, they believe in their religion authentically. They own it to what they believe. They want to study it. They will defend it verbally through argumentation, what they believe in. And it seems that there could be two authentic believers in different religions that's indistinguishably justified to a third person. But as it turns out, if the third person is a Christian, and there's a Christian and there's a Muslim, and that Christian, the third person, because he shares some evidence with the Christian person who's in a debate, then he will have access to the evidence that the Christian has. So he might think the Christian is on the side of the right. It's more convincing for them. And on the other hand, in an interaction like this, we will have to see what evidence the adjudicator has, and that's what usually makes a difference, I think. And what's important is that we can have authentic believers that's indistinguishable to someone without their corresponding evidence. We can't tell whose beliefs are true simply by that. But I think in our religious dialogue, we have to make our presuppositions, religious ones, explicitly. If you believe in that, and in your, it's just like bias, right? So if you make your biases clearly, stated clearly, then people would know what to look for and what to watch out, and even you yourself could monitor whether you have the biases in interaction with others. And that's just being honest, I think, to yourself and to your interlocutors. And what's important is to identify common ground. So maybe when I speak with an atheist, he might not have believed in Elijah's. He can command certain things on those that are in competition with him. And maybe some atheists would not believe in that story in the Bible, but maybe even an atheist would believe in Christian counseling, in the positive psychology of Christianity, that in personal growth of believing or hoping or being optimistic. So these they saw people who grow better with Christianity, and these are the data that they will accept, and these are the common ground. And given that we have a common ground, then we can discuss whether it was something was spiritual or something divine, something that's supernatural that helped the person. So if we have a common ground and make it clear, then we can have a dialogue that's clearly, we know what our boundaries are. So I've talked about that because time is limited, about knowing what one knows without knowing that one knows that one knows. And it's good that sometimes when I know that I know, I think I have a theory about my faith, but I still want to call into question what I think I know and understand my faith better, because some people might challenge my faith, and through their challenges, I will understand, how my theory could have been wrong. And without them having another perspective, I would not have seen myself in a clearer light, right? So especially, even if there are competing theories of spirituality, Buddhists, they have their explanation of their spirituality, and Christian, they have theirs. But it doesn't mean that, the other one would make me make my theory false. It's just competing theories, right? So listening to others, given your conviction and being open to others, it's actually very healthy, I think. And that humility is not a pretense, right? It's you have a theory and you believe in what you believe in, but you're still open that, well, maybe there are other people who also believe in and they have a theory, and we want to know who's right and who's wrong, and to be open about the possibility that we might be mistaken. And it's important to understand what others' beliefs are and what other doctrines are, especially to find out what a distinguishing evidence, right, and how it could have been acquired. And especially with Christianity, one very simple distinguishing evidence is the second coming of the Christ, or maybe even after we die. It's, of course, it sounds a little bit like a joke. Well, we will know after we died, and you will see that you're wrong. But some atheists say, yeah, after we're dead, we're dead. So what are we what evidence will we have after we're dead? So, but that's a distinguishing evidence according, if you take the faith seriously. That's really how it tells the difference. Even though right now, we might be rational to believe in what we believe in, but we don't know that we are rational. It's like we have to die in order to know that we've been right. It sounds strange, but that's really how it works out. And before we die, we can't tell who's better, right? So that's how we can engage in dialogue, knowing that we can't tell the difference between who's right yet. We know that we can't tell the difference, and that's important yet, right? So, and lastly, I want to, because I've been talking about our right over minors. And so when we commit others to my conviction, of course, we do that. We hope that they will be committed to what we believe in through their own choice. When we persuade them, we hope to let them feel the friendship in our religion among our practitioners, and let them know the truth that we believe in, and hope that they will be persuaded. And that's very different from imposing your conviction on others, because many wars and violence are committed in the name of religion, and you're not trying to persuade other people of your religion. You're not trying to convert them. You're acting on your religion through committing it, imposing it on others, on non-believers, and on a liberal ground. Maybe some religion do commit believers to do certain things to non-believers, but on today's society, on a liberal society, that's wrong. And so conviction, and if we're only talking about discussion, we can have conviction and humility. And especially, even if you have the commitment and the conviction, when we are to persuade others, when we commit others to our conviction, it's even it does much more violence if your conviction got you to impose your conviction to others instead of just to persuade. So that's a caveat that I have to point out, that the exclusivism that I am committed to is not at all like that. All right, so okay, so this is it. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation. Unless you need it up, do me a favor and go ahead and stop sharing.
Yeah.
You and I can talk. Wonderful. So help me understand something. I'm a little bit confused. So when you began your discussion, you started talking about basically human rights violations, the freedom of speech, things like that. But then you went into rationality and spirituality. Help me understand, what's the connection between the two here?
All right. So it's human rights that we have the freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. And if the freedom is restricted with right and wrong, or especially with expression, we are to discuss whether we can say whatever we want, right? But if whatever we want to say, it has to be, because even with the human rights, the declaration, it's to impart information to others. So it's not disinformation, it's not misinformation. It is information. It has to tell others something true. So the freedom, the exercise of the freedom is restricted with truthfulness, right? Okay, so we go back to spirituality. If we're free to think whatever we think, still we seem to be restricted by what's true. But in the realm of spirituality, the point about what's objective and what's true, it's very complicated. And that's why there's this interaction. And there's rational, maybe we are reasonable to engage in our spiritual practices, but it might have turned out to be irrational without us ever knowing whether we are, until, let's say, until we die, or until we achieve a certain state of mind, right? So, so in a nutshell, there's a liberalism about freedom of speech, but I also want to know what's the limit. And I'm bringing the.
Would you argue that people still have the right to believe whatever they want, even if it's irrational, contradictory to known facts, if it's internally inconsistent, incoherent? Would you argue that people still have the right to believe those things?
Okay. If we're talking about it, if I were to rephrase you, if we were to talk about whether we have the right to do the wrong thing because to believe something, well, there's a difference between irrational thing that we know to be irrational and irrational thing that we don't know to be irrational. So maybe even right now, if I go to swim, and I caught COVID-19, maybe that's irrational, but on what I think is all right, maybe it's not that bad. And so a very simple point is, I would rephrase what you say to be whether we have the right to do the wrong thing, and I think we don't. But the problem is, who's to decide? Well, what's right? It's simple, but what's wrong and what's the boundary? And especially when the wrong thing is something that only interferes with your own well-being. That's when it gets complicated. And
well, what you're talking about are two different things here. I'm wanting to know, epistemically and legally, do people have the right to believe something? I'm not talking about moral actions. I'm talking about, do they have the right to believe irrational, inconsistent, incoherent beliefs?
Okay.
Do you
it's
think
legal right?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, if it's legal right, I don't think the law should limit what anyone thinks.
Okay.
Yeah.
But now you're setting up these criteria, though. You're talking about rationality and objectivity, things like that. But these are not simple concepts. And playing devil's advocate, I could convince you 100 different ways, 100 different things that are rational, and you may not originally think that they're rational. There's far too many cognitive distortions, cognitive illusions that happen, and that prohibit us from having an objective understanding and interpretation of reality. And rationality, well, that in and of itself is not an officialized thing. Not everybody there are no real sets of criteria that everybody agrees on what makes something rational. And in fact, there are some religious beliefs, the ancient Christian church, for one, that believed being rational was a bad thing. That if your faith was rational, then it wasn't truly God. So you're setting up these criteria for what is epistemically good and even morally good. And I'm wondering, why do you have these criteria in place when in fact not everybody's going to agree with that criteria? And the reason I'm asking this is why impose this criteria when we're talking about interreligious dialogue? How can that help religions dialogue with each other?
I see. About their different criterion of rationality, it depends on whether you want to get down to whether the difference in criterion will in the end depends on the truth of the doctrine. Because what I'm saying is very simple. If you believe in something false, then that's irrational. That's all it is. And that criterion is something that I hope to be universal.
Right, but you understand that some religions actually think of that as a benefit, that as a good thing. For instance, the first 500 years of Christianity, that was the belief. They wanted Christianity to be irrational. They thought that meant it was divinely inspired. Rationality as a criteria of Christian thought didn't come around until the modern era. So I'm asking, you're imposing this criterion and you're saying, yeah, if they believe something that's irrational, then it must be wrong. Okay, that's what you want. But how does that further dialogue between the religions? Why even impose this criteria in the first place?
I think I would have to go back to the Christianity a bit first before going into interreligious, because even back in those days when maybe in the medieval time, I think they would think that that they can endure suffering and they can keep their faith in during that time. That's how they experience God. And I don't think that's irrational. And it's the whole point about the belief being true, that Christ will help them, that they will have the salvation, that they commit to their way. It's the truth of the belief that keeps them going. And that's, of course, I understand how reason and faith interacts in the past. It's especially when science, let's say, and logic and philosophy has defeated faith, especially in face of that, you still believe in it. It looks like that's a virtue, right? That's the virtue of faith, the virtue of So that's and in that context, I would want to instead of being an argumentation against philosophy and science, I think that the project of faith seeking understanding, that's exactly what answers that. And if a faith is irrational, then there's nothing to understand. But if given the faith is rational, then we can understand how it is that it is rational. So I haven't answered you the second. Yeah, okay.
Well, when the Christian church established doctrines such as the Trinity and the hypostatic union, the dual natures of Christ, they publicly said these are irrational beliefs. And because they are irrational, that means it's true. This is, in fact, part and parcel of Christian belief. So if you are, in fact, a Christian, then you are, in fact, ascribing to dogma and doctrines that pride itself on being irrational. This in the ancient world was considered a good thing for the ancient Christians. Knowing this, why would you impose criteria on other religions and other beliefs to say your beliefs should be rational, when in fact your own doctrines and the people who established these doctrines hundreds of years ago, they didn't, not only did they say it wasn't rational, they said it was good that it was irrational.
Okay.
So why are you imposing rationality as a criteria now?
Okay. Well, I have to check the letters of what they describe as irrational, because if irrationality and reason is simply about having reasons that's in response to challenges, then I think that there could be stance that you can't answer to oppositions, but it doesn't show that it's irrational. What I want to say is that I want to know how is it that described that it's irrational? Because there's a way to understand the Trinity that's rational, I think. Yeah.
Well, if you can define or describe the Trinity in a rational manner, then you have fallen into heresy, because there's absolutely no way to do so.
Okay.
My point isn't to argue about church history, and what I'm saying are facts. This isn't a dispute. These aren't my opinions. They genuinely believed that irrationality was a prize of Christianity.
Okay.
What my point is, though, is how does this help interreligious dialogue? I'm wanting to know, you've established rationality as a criteria, but why is that even being brought up when we're talking about interreligious dialogue? Help me make the connection here.
Okay. Okay. Reasonableness would be more important when we engage in religious dialogue, I think, to understand how others' beliefs are reasonable, what their case are, and how it's coherent, how they have a picture of the world that makes sense. Of course, this still has to answer you, because, well, even it's not on irrationality. Maybe even the Christian Church, according to the history that you just stated, it's even unreasonable, because the Trinity is incoherent. Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Okay.
I think one of the concerns that I have is, if we were to sit down at the table, right? Christians, Jews, Muslims, and the Christian sits down at the table and begins the discussion by saying, I want to know how your religion is reasonable and is rational. It immediately creates an antagonism, because what's happening here when we establish or introduce criteria like that is you are introducing the criteria simply to critique the other religion. That's immediately going to make the other side become defensive and wonder why you're trying to critique. So that's so for you personally, you may say, I don't want to hold to a belief system that is irrational. I know for me, that's definitely my belief as well. I don't want to hold to a belief system that is irrational or illogical. But that's for me. To impose that on others, or to require that to be to even engage in the discussion and have that as a requirement, may actually cause hostility and not actual dialogue. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's the only thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So
go ahead.
I want to, okay, let me rephrase how I would think an interreligious dialogue would think. So a very typical way, we invite someone from different faiths and share their experiences, share what they believe in. And of course, when they share what they believe in, other people would think, oh, but how could this be consistent with that? People would question that. And that question is, let's say, maybe I want, well, there are two ways to when we engage in question and answer. One way is that I want to buy your product, let's say, and then we want to ask more questions about before we buy it. And another way is just start with a bystander and want to evaluate whatever you said as false. Of course, the latter way would be more on the side that's hostile, I think. But if we're on the first side, that's when you have the humility, you're open to that you might be wrong as well. You want to see how is it reasonable, and especially when they share the personal experiences. We are here to understand what they believe in. Well, it's in virtue of a genuine understanding that you can engage in dialogue. Even if the dialogue is in the form of criticism, it seems like criticism, but when you raise a question, when you are confused, when you want to know more, how is it that the beliefs are at least consistent, coherent? How is it that they can have that experience? So I think in a very simple way is that I want to buy what you're selling, but I want to know more instead of just, if you're not here to buy the product, there's still a question of why you get there. Maybe you're auditing them. Maybe you're really trying to find flaw. And this latter way is, there may be a situation when we do that, especially Christian crowd apologetics, they do that, but it's that confrontation isn't exactly what I have in mind.
Okay. Well, it sounds like what you're trying to say is, by asking these questions, you're asking them, explain to me why your faith is reasonable to you. Maybe it may not necessarily be rational according to logical dictates, but help me understand why your faith is reasonable for you. Is that so that you can better understand their perspective and where they're coming from? Is that kind of where you're coming from, what you're saying?
Yes, but the process of explaining the reasonableness for the believer is also to take an objective presupposition. So it isn't just like, well, I feel this, I feel that God is touching me, and that's why I believe it. But instead, I think someone would say, well, I feel God, I experienced Him, instead of just using internal. In virtue of trying to demonstrate one's rationality, one is making a case of one's reasonableness, instead of just saying how one is reasonable. There's a slight difference. I don't know whether that makes sense to you.
Yes, I would just go back to my original concern that we need to be careful to say what I think is objective or what I think is reasonable isn't always applicable and may not actually be correct. And for some religions, for some belief systems, they in fact, the entire system is based off of subjective feelings. And that may not be the case for you. It certainly isn't the case for me, but it is for others. And if we were to immediately come to the table and say, I'm sorry, but you need to tell me why your faith is objectively true, then we create that animosity.
Okay.
So I feel like we need to be open. If we're going to have interfaith dialogue, we need to be open to the possibility that other people don't prize objectivity like we do. And that's very difficult because.
Comment,
Go ahead.
Yeah, a quick comment is that there's an objectivity to whether you do have that subjectivity, right? Maybe you have that subjectivity, but I don't share it. I've never practiced it. I'm not brought up in the faith that someone else is brought up. So whether someone had that subjectivity, it's still an objective fact. And it's an objective fact that I don't share the subjectivity. So it's all right that someone makes a case about their subjective feelings to make a case about, well, maybe they'll say it's reasonable, but maybe they would also say that, well, it's objectively so, because some Christians would think that, well, he's not blessed with the experience with God, so they don't have the experience yet. Some people would say that, right? So that's an objective fact about one having their subjective feelings or not. And with that in mind, it's not a difference between living in a different world, but it's a difference between in the same world with different experiences.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's an interesting point you're trying to make, that somebody being objectively subjective, which is a great paradox. Well, thank you so much, Chung Wai Lak. I really appreciate your presentation
Yeah.
and doing this for us.
Thank you.
I want to say to everybody who attended live, thank you for coming out and supporting us. I really appreciate it. We will have all of these presentations recordings handed out to everybody who attended. So give us a couple of weeks and we'll have everything edited and put out for you guys. Again, Chung Wai Lak, thank you so much for your presentation. I'll give you the final word.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's been a great process to work out what I want to talk about, especially applying what I've learned from my academic philosophy study to my faith and also in interaction with others. And this is a very great discussion. I learned what it is to interact academically, intellectually with other faiths. And thank you very much for this opportunity.